They thought he had crossed a line no man could survive. By sunrise, they would learn he had drawn one instead. The valley held its breath in that pale gray hour before dawn, when the air still carried the night's chill and the dust had not yet begun to rise, and out beyond the fence line of Elias Boone's weathered ranch, shapes gathered where no shapes had stood the night before, silent, unmoving, watching. Men in the town half a mile down the road would later swear they felt it before they saw it, that something in the wind had shifted, like the land itself was waiting for a verdict. Elias stood on his porch with one hand resting on the rough wood post, boots planted in the dry earth, eyes fixed on the horizon where the figures had begun to take form, one becoming 5, 5 becoming 20, and then too many to count without losing track of the edges. Horses stood steady beneath them, heads low, breaths low, as if even the animals understood that noise had no place here. Someone in town muttered his name like it already belonged to a grave. They said he should have stayed out of it, should have kept walking when he saw her, should have remembered the quiet rules that kept a man alive out here: don't interfere, don't ask questions, and never stand between trouble and its target. But that was last night, and last night had been different. The memory came back to him not as noise, but as fragments: the narrow stretch behind the abandoned stable, the smell of dry hay and old wood, the way the girl had pressed herself against the wall like she could disappear into it, her dark eyes sharp even through fear, and the men closing in with that easy confidence that comes from believing no one will stop you. He hadn't known her name then. He hadn't known where she came from or who might come looking for her. All he had known was the look in her eyes, not pleading, not begging, but braced, like she had already accepted whatever came next. That was the moment he stepped forward. Not fast, not loud. Just enough to be seen. The kind of step a man takes when he decides something simple and final: not this, not here. Now, as the first line of riders stopped just beyond his fence, the morning light catching on beads, leather, and the quiet weight of presence, Elias felt the town waking behind him, doors opening, boots hitting dirt, whispers building like dry leaves in the wind. No one came to stand beside him. They watched from a distance, the way people watch a storm roll in, curious, afraid, and grateful it isn't theirs. One of the riders shifted, and the line moved as one, not forward, not back, just enough to remind anyone looking that this was not a gathering by accident. Elias didn't reach for his gun. He hadn't last night, and he wouldn't now. His gaze stayed steady, not defiant, not submissive, just present, the way a man stands when he has nothing left to trade but his word and the choice he already made. Somewhere behind those riders, he knew, was the answer to what he had stepped into, something larger than 3 men in an alley, larger than a single act that should have ended when the girl slipped away before sunrise, leaving behind only silence and a small piece of turquoise that still sat in his pocket, heavier than it had any right to be. The first rider dismounted, boots touching the earth with care, and in that quiet motion, the entire valley seemed to lean in, waiting to see whether the man they had called a fool the night before had just made the biggest mistake of his life, or the one choice that would change everything. The town had never quite known what to make of Elias Boone, and that was the closest thing to peace a man like him could get out here. He was not important enough to be admired, not troublesome enough to be feared, just a quiet figure on the edge of everything, like a fence post no one noticed until it leaned too far. His ranch sat a good half-mile outside the last line of buildings, where the land flattened into hard, sun-baked earth and the wind carried more dust than conversation. The place was small, barely enough to keep a handful of cattle and one stubborn horse, with a house that looked older than it was, boards faded gray and a roof that spoke in creaks whenever the temperature shifted. Elias had built it that way on purpose, nothing fancy, nothing that invited attention, just enough to live and be left alone. He had come to this stretch of land years ago after drifting from job to job across the territory, riding trails, mending fences, sleeping under more open skies than roofs, until one day he simply stopped moving. People assumed he had a past he was hiding, something that explained the way he kept his words short and his eyes steady, but the truth was less dramatic and more stubborn. He had seen enough men talk themselves into doing nothing when something should have been done, enough moments where silence passed for wisdom and left a mark that never quite faded. So he chose a different kind of quiet, one where he did not speak much, but when he stood, he stayed standing. That was the only rule he kept, and most days it did not cost him anything. Most days, the hardest decision he faced was whether to ride out before the heat climbed past 90 degrees or wait until evening when the shadows stretched long and the air cooled just enough to breathe without tasting dust. The town did not mind him as long as he stayed in his lane, buying supplies once every couple of weeks, tipping his hat without lingering, never getting involved in disputes that did not concern him. Men like Sheriff Dalton preferred it that way, and men like Clyde Mercer counted on it, because a quiet town is easy to shape if no one steps out of line. That was the unspoken agreement everyone lived by, and it held steady right up until the moment Elias broke it without warning. It had not felt like a decision at the time, not something he weighed or measured, just a shift in direction, a step that placed him between a girl who did not belong to this town and men who believed that gave them permission. He had not known her name then, had not known that the dust on her dress carried miles of distance or that the way she held her chin was something taught, not born. All he had seen was that she was alone, and that the men closing in were not interested in anything but what they could take. That was enough. Now, standing on his porch with the morning light growing stronger and the line of riders stretching farther than he could count, Elias understood something the town had not yet caught up to. Whatever he had stepped into last night had not ended when the girl disappeared before sunrise. It had only just begun, and the kind of quiet he had lived by all these years was about to be tested in a way that would not allow him to step back into it again. The memory of that night did not come back to Elias all at once, it came in pieces, like dust carried on the wind, each part settling slowly until the full shape of it stood clear. The alley behind the abandoned stable had been narrow, no more than 8 feet across, with broken planks leaning against one wall and the smell of old hay hanging thick in the air. The sun had already dipped low, leaving the space in that gray light where shadows stretched longer than they should. That was where he saw her for the first time. She stood pressed against the far wall, one hand braced behind her, the other clutching the edge of her torn sleeve, her breathing steady in a way that did not match the situation. Most people in her place would have been frantic, loud, desperate to run. She was none of those things. Her eyes moved instead, sharp and aware, tracking every shift of the men around her as if she had already measured each one. 3 of them, boots heavy in the dirt, hats low, voices carrying that careless tone of men who believed the world owed them something. Clyde Mercer stood closest, turning something small and blue between his fingers, a piece of turquoise that caught the last of the light. He smiled without warmth and said something low that made the other 2 chuckle, the sound flat and empty. The girl did not answer him. She did not plead. She simply held her ground, and that seemed to bother them more than anything else. Elias had not meant to stop. He had been passing through, leading his horse by the reins, mind set on getting back before dark settled in. He could have kept walking. No one would have blamed him. No one would have expected otherwise. But then one of the men took a step closer, and the girl's shoulder hit the wall behind her with a soft sound that carried farther than it should have. That was the moment something shifted. Elias did not draw his gun. He did not raise his voice. He just stepped into the space between them, placing himself where the light from the open end of the alley fell across his shoulders, enough to be seen clearly, enough to interrupt what was about to happen without turning it into something louder. The men paused, not out of respect, but out of surprise, like someone had walked into a story they thought belonged only to them. Clyde looked up first, his expression changing slowly as recognition settled in. He knew Elias, or at least knew of him, the quiet rancher who kept to himself, who did not interfere, who had no reason to be standing there now. "You lost, Boone?" he asked, his tone light but edged with something sharper underneath. Elias shook his head once, a small movement, and answered just as simply, "No." The word hung there, heavier than it sounded. The air shifted. The girl's eyes flicked to him, just for a second, searching, measuring, the same way she had measured the others. There was no gratitude in that look, not yet, only caution, as if she was trying to understand why a man like him would place himself in a line that was not his. One of the other men laughed, low and dismissive, and gestured toward the open street as if to remind Elias that leaving was still an option. It was, in that moment, the easiest path. Walk away, and nothing that followed would touch him. Stay, and everything might. Elias did not move. He rested his hand lightly on the reins, his other hand hanging loose at his side, not reaching for anything, not threatening, just present. Step away from her, he said, his voice even, carrying no force beyond the certainty behind it. The alley fell quiet in a way that made the distant sounds of the town feel miles away. Clyde's smile faded just enough to show that he understood what was being asked of him, and more importantly, what it would mean to refuse. You putting yourself in this? He asked, tilting his head slightly, as if the idea itself did not quite make sense. Elias met his gaze and did not look away. She is alone, he said. That was all. No speech. No explanation. Just a fact, laid down. Like a line in the dust. For a long second, no one moved. Then the balance shifted, subtle but real, the kind of shift that does not announce itself but changes everything that comes after. And from that point on, there was no simple way back to the quiet Elias Boone had known before. For a moment, it looked like the world might hold its breath and let the moment pass without consequence, like dust settling after a passing wagon, quiet and forgettable, but men like Clyde Mercer did not step back from anything that challenged them without leaving something behind. He turned the small turquoise piece once more between his fingers, slower now, his eyes never leaving Elias, measuring not the man's size or strength, but the stillness in him, the kind that did not come from confidence but from decision already made. You always keep to yourself, Boone, Clyde said, his voice lower now, less careless, as if the air itself had changed shape around them, and yet here you are, choosing a side that is not yours. Elias did not answer right away. He did not look at the other two men who had shifted their weight, uncertain now, glancing between Clyde and the stranger who had stepped into their path without raising a hand. He only kept his eyes forward, steady, like a man watching a horizon that was not going to move for him. There is no side here, he said finally. Just a line. The words landed without force, but they stayed. Clyde's jaw tightened slightly, the smile that had once been easy now held in place by something less certain. He looked past Elias for a brief second, toward the girl, as if expecting her to break the silence, to say something that would tip the balance back into something familiar. She did not. She stood where she was, her breathing even again, her eyes no longer on the men who had cornered her, but on the one who had stepped in between. That seemed to unsettle Clyde more than anything else. He flipped the turquoise piece once into the air and caught it again, then held it up where the fading light touched it. This yours? He asked, though the answer did not matter. The girl's gaze flicked to it for just a heartbeat, and in that moment something unspoken passed through. The space between all of them, something Elias did not yet understand, but felt settle into place like a stone dropped into water. Clyde lowered his hand slowly, then stepped back half a pace, not enough to admit anything, just enough to change the shape of the moment. This is not finished, he said, not loud, not angry, just certain, like a promise made without needing witnesses. He turned, motioning to the other two, and they followed, though not without one last glance back, the kind that said this would not be forgotten. Their boots faded into the dust beyond the alley, their voices swallowed by the open space of the town, and just like that, the pressure that had filled the narrow passage lifted, leaving behind only the quiet and the faint scent of dry hay. Elias did not move right away. He waited until the last trace of their presence was gone, until the silence felt real again, before he stepped aside, creating space where there had been none. You can go, he said, his voice softer now, not directed, just offered. The girl did not move immediately. She looked at him for a long second, her expression unreadable, as if she was weighing something far beyond what had just happened. Then she stepped forward, slowly, her movements careful but not weak, passing by him with just enough distance to avoid contact, but close enough that he could see the fine dust on her skin, the steadiness in her eyes. She stopped once she reached the mouth of the alley, turning slightly, the last of the light catching the line of her face. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear, carrying no fear now, only a question that seemed to reach deeper than the moment itself. Elias did not take long to answer. "Because you were alone," he said. Nothing more. No explanation, no justification. Just the same truth he had already chosen. She studied him for another second, then gave a small nod, not in gratitude, not in agreement, but in recognition, like she had found something she had not expected to see. Without another word, she stepped out into the open street and was gone, swallowed by the gathering dusk, leaving Elias standing in the fading light, unaware that the line he had drawn in that quiet alley would reach far beyond anything he could see. The town did not forget what it had seen, but it chose to pretend it had not mattered, the way people do when something unsettles the order they rely on to feel safe. By the time Elias rode back to his ranch that evening, the sky had turned a deep orange, stretching long shadows across the dry ground, and the wind carried low voices from the direction of the saloon, already shaping the story into something easier to accept. Some said he had been reckless, others said he had been foolish, and a few claimed he had simply been unlucky to cross paths with the wrong kind of trouble. No one said he had been right. Elias did not stop to listen. He guided his horse through the narrow gate, the hinges giving their usual tired creak, and closed it behind him with the same steady motion he had done 1,000 times before. The ranch looked exactly as it always had, unchanged, indifferent to whatever lines had been drawn beyond its fence. The small barn leaned slightly to one side, the water trough half full, the porch catching the last light of the day. It should have felt like a return to something familiar, something untouched, but there was a difference now, subtle and hard to name, like the air before a storm that had not yet formed. Elias unsaddled his horse in silence, running his hand along its neck in a slow, absent motion, then carried his gear inside, setting it down with care. He moved through the same routine, checking the latch, pouring water, lighting the oil lamp as dusk settled in, each action measured, each step grounded in habit, but his mind did not settle with them. It stayed somewhere else, back in that alley, replaying small details that had not made sense at the time. The way Clyde had held the turquoise piece, not like it was worth money, but like it meant something else. The way the girl had looked at it, just for a second, as if it carried more weight than its size. And most of all, the way she had asked him why, not with suspicion, not with gratitude, but with something closer to curiosity, like she had not expected the answer he gave. Elias sat at the small wooden table near the window, the lamp casting a soft circle of light across the worn surface, and reached into his pocket without thinking. His fingers closed around something cool and smooth that had not been there earlier that day. He brought it out slowly, setting it on the table where the light could catch it. A small piece of turquoise, wrapped in thin leather, marked with patterns that were not random, lines that curved and crossed in a way that suggested meaning, not decoration. He did not remember her giving it to him. He did not remember taking it. Yet there it was, resting in front of him like it had always belonged there. He leaned back slightly, studying it, the silence of the room pressing in around him, broken only by the faint creak of the wood and the distant sound of wind brushing against the walls. It would have been easy to dismiss it as something dropped in a confusion, something left behind without intention, but that did not sit right. Nothing about her had felt careless. The way she moved, the way she spoke, even the way she left had carried purpose. Elias reached out and turned the piece gently with his fingers, watching how the light shifted across its surface, how the pattern seemed to change depending on the angle. Outside, the last of the daylight faded, and the darkness settled fully over the land, quiet and complete. Somewhere in that silence, a thought formed, not loud, not certain, but steady enough to remain. Whatever had happened in that alley had not ended when she walked away. It had only set something in motion, something tied to the small piece of turquoise now resting on his table, something that would not stay quiet for long. The night did not bring rest, only a quieter kind of waiting, the kind that settles into the bones without asking permission, and by the time the first hint of gray touched the horizon, Elias was already awake, sitting at the same table with the turquoise piece still resting where he had left it, catching the faintest light of morning. The air felt different, not colder, not warmer, just heavier, like something unseen had moved closer during the hours when the world was supposed to sleep. He stepped outside before the sun broke fully, boots pressing into the dry earth with a sound that seemed louder than usual in the stillness. His eyes scanning the open land out of habit more than concern. For a long second, nothing moved. The fence line stretched empty, the distant hills quiet, the sky pale and wide. Then the wind shifted. It was subtle, a change in direction that carried with it a faint vibration, not quite a sound, more like the ground remembering something. Elias turned slightly, narrowing his gaze toward the far edge of the valley where the land dipped just enough to hide whatever lay beyond. That was when he saw it. Not shapes at first, not riders, just a thin line of dust rising where no wagon road ran, where no cattle had reason to pass at this hour. It grew slowly, almost politely, as if whatever was coming did not need to rush. Elias did not move toward his rifle. He did not call for anyone. There was no one to call. Instead, he reached into his pocket and felt the edge of the turquoise piece again, grounding himself in something real as the dust line thickened, forming into something with weight and intention. Minutes passed, though they did not feel like minutes, more like a stretch of time pulled thin, and then the first shapes began to emerge from the haze. Riders. 1 became 3. 3 became 10. 10 became more than he could count without losing track of the edges. They did not spread out like a search party. They moved as one, a single line that held its shape as it advanced, steady, controlled, each horse stepping in rhythm with the others. No voices carried across the distance. No shouts. No warnings. Just the sound of hooves, low and measured, like a heartbeat that had found its pace. Elias stepped forward off the porch, the wood creaking softly behind him, and came to a stop just inside the gate, his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture unchanged from the night before. He did not mistake what he was seeing. This was not coincidence. This was not a group passing through. This was purpose, arriving in silence. The line slowed as it reached the boundary of his land, the first riders coming into clear view now, their faces marked not with anger, not with haste, but with something older, something that did not need to prove itself through noise. They stopped as one, just beyond the fence. Forming a wall that did not need to move to be understood. The dust settled around them, falling back to the ground as if it had completed its task. Behind Elias, far down the road, he could feel the town waking, doors opening, people stepping out into the early light, drawn by the same quiet pull that had brought his attention to the valley. He did not turn to look. Whatever was about to happen did not belong to them. It had come here, to this piece of land, to the line he had drawn without knowing what it would call forth. A single rider at the front shifted slightly, then swung down from the saddle with a deliberate calm, boots touching the earth with care, as if the ground itself mattered. Elias held his position, his eyes steady, the turquoise piece now resting in his palm, unseen by anyone but him. The man began to walk forward, each step measured, closing the distance not as an approach, but as an answer. And in that quiet, with the sun finally breaking over the horizon and casting light across both of them, Elias understood that whatever had been set in motion the night before had reached him now, not with chaos, not with force, but with something far more difficult to face. Judgment, carried in silence. The man who stepped forward did not carry himself like someone seeking permission, and yet there was no threat in the way he moved, only a certainty that made the space between him and Elias feel measured, deliberate, as if every step had already been decided long before this morning arrived. He stopped just short of the fence, close enough that the details of his face became clear, lines shaped by years and decisions, eyes steady in a way that did not wander or question. Behind him, the riders remained still, their silence holding like a wall that needed no reinforcement. Elias did not speak first. He had learned long ago that some moments were not meant to be filled with words, that saying less often revealed more. The man's gaze dropped briefly to Elias's hand, to the small piece of turquoise resting in his palm, then lifted again, meeting his eyes with a look that carried recognition, not surprise. You kept it, the man said, his voice low but clear, each word placed with care, as if it mattered how it was heard. Elias glanced down at the turquoise for a fraction of a second, then back up. It found its way to me, he replied. The man gave the slightest nod, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, like a piece of a larger pattern had settled into place. Behind Elias, the sound of approaching footsteps grew, uneven, uncertain. He did not need to turn to know the town had come closer, drawn by curiosity stronger than caution. Sheriff Dalton's voice carried first, strained beneath an attempt at authority. "Boone," he called out, "you need to step aside. This is not your matter." Elias did not move. The words passed over him without landing. The man at the fence did not look toward the voice either, as if it belonged to something outside the moment that mattered. Instead, he reached slowly toward his belt and removed a small object, holding it out where the morning light could touch it. Another piece of turquoise, similar but not identical, bound in leather, marked with patterns that mirrored the one in Elias's hand. Two halves of something that had once been whole. Elias felt the weight of his own piece shift, not physically, but in meaning, as if it had been waiting for this moment to be understood. "You stood when she was alone," the man said, his tone unchanged, neither praise nor accusation, just a statement placed between them. Elias held his gaze, the same answer forming in him as it had the night before, simple and complete. "Yes," he said. The word settled into the space, and something in the air shifted again, not tension, not release, but recognition, like a door opening quietly. Behind the man, one of the riders moved, then another, a subtle ripple through the line that did not break its shape but changed its presence. Sheriff Dalton stepped closer now, his boots crunching against the dry ground, his voice sharper, edged with something that sounded like urgency trying to become control. "I said step aside, Boone," he repeated, louder this time, as if volume could claim authority that certainty had not. The man at the fence finally turned his head, just slightly, enough to acknowledge the voice without giving it weight. His eyes passed over the sheriff and the small cluster of townspeople behind him, then returned to Elias, dismissing everything else without a word. "This is between those who stood," he said quietly. The words were not raised, but they carried farther than the sheriff's had, settling over the gathering like dust that did not need to be shaken off. Elias remained where he was, the turquoise piece still in his hand, the morning light now fully spread across the land, revealing everything and changing nothing. He did not yet know what judgment would come, whether it would take something from him or leave him as he was, but he understood one thing clearly. The line he had drawn was no longer his alone. It had been seen, measured, and returned to him in a form he could not ignore. And whatever came next would not be decided by fear, or noise, or the will of a town that had chosen silence when it mattered. It would be decided here, in the quiet, between two men who understood exactly what had been done. The man at the fence did not raise his voice, did not signal with his hands, yet something passed through the line behind him as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, and the stillness shifted into motion with a purpose that did not need to hurry. One rider stepped forward, then another, each moving with care, carrying not weapons drawn or threats displayed, but objects held openly, visible to anyone watching. Elias's eyes followed the movement, not with suspicion, but with a growing understanding that this was not the kind of reckoning the town had expected. The first man reached the fence and placed something across the top rail, a bundle wrapped in clean cloth, tied with leather, set down with the same respect one might give to something that holds value beyond its weight. He stepped back without a word. Another followed, placing a second bundle beside the first. Then a third. The pattern continued, each rider approaching, setting down what they carried, and returning to the line, until the fence that had once marked the edge of Elias's land became lined with offerings that spoke in a language older than the town behind him. Murmurs rose from the gathered townspeople, confusion replacing the certainty they had carried only moments before. Sheriff Dalton took a step forward, his authority thinning with every second. This did not turn into what he had expected. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice sharper now, but it did not land where he intended. The man before Elias did not turn. He did not acknowledge the question. Instead, he lifted the turquoise piece in his hand slightly, aligning it with the one Elias held, the two halves catching the same light, revealing how the patterns joined, how the lines completed one another when seen together. "This is witness," the man said quietly. "Not to what was taken, but to what was given." Elias felt the words settle deeper than their sound, understanding unfolding not in a rush, but in layers. The girl. Nayeli. She had not been running without reason. She had been carrying something, not just the turquoise, but a responsibility that extended beyond herself. The man lowered his hand and continued, his voice steady, each word placed where it belonged. "She walks between worlds. She carries messages that keep peace where others would bring fire. Last night, men who do not honor any law tried to take that from her." He paused, not for effect, but because the weight of what followed did not need to be rushed. "You stood where no law stood. You held a line that was not yours, and you did not move." Behind Elias, the murmurs shifted again, quieter now, less certain, as the shape of the story they had told themselves began to break apart. Clyde Mercer's name passed through the crowd in hushed tones, no longer spoken with confidence, but with the uneasy recognition that something had been misunderstood. The man at the fence took one step closer, not crossing onto Elias's land, but closing the distance enough that his presence could not be mistaken for anything but intentional. "For that," he said, his gaze steady, "we do not repay with words." He gestured slightly toward the line of bundles along the fence, toward the riders who had brought them, toward the silence that had carried them here without conflict. "We repay with what endures." Elias did not look away. He did not reach for the offerings. He simply stood, the turquoise piece still in his hand, the morning light now fully risen, casting no shadows deep enough to hide behind. The man studied him for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, not as a command, not as a dismissal, but as recognition completed. Behind him, the riders remained still, their presence no longer a threat, but a statement, one that did not need to be spoken twice. And in that quiet, with the town watching and the line between worlds no longer invisible, the meaning of what had happened began to settle into place, not as something loud or dramatic, but as something far more difficult to ignore. Respect, given where it had not been expected, and returned in a way that could not be mistaken. The man did not wait for thanks, and he did not ask for anything in return, because what had been given had already been seen, and what had been seen did not need to be spoken again. He stepped back from the fence, returning to his place at the front of the line, and for a moment everything held in that quiet balance, the kind that comes only when something true has settled between people who understand it without explanation. Then he raised his hand, just slightly, and the riders behind him responded as one, turning their horses with a smoothness that carried no urgency, no lingering doubt, only completion. The line began to move away from the ranch, not in haste, not in retreat, but in the same measured rhythm they had arrived with, the sound of hooves soft against the dry ground, fading gradually as distance reclaimed the space they had filled. Elias stood where he was, watching them go, the turquoise piece still resting in his hand, its surface warm now from his grip, no longer just an object, but something that had passed through meaning and come back changed. Behind him, the town remained gathered, though the energy had shifted in a way that no one seemed ready to address. Sheriff Dalton lowered his voice, no longer calling out, no longer trying to shape the moment into something he could control. The men who had once spoken with certainty now stood with their hats in their hands or their eyes turned away, the weight of what they had witnessed settling into places they could not easily ignore. No one stepped forward to claim authority. No one offered judgment. For once, the town had nothing to say. Elias did not turn to face them right away. He remained at the fence, looking at the line of bundles left behind, each one placed with intention, each one a quiet answer to something that had not been asked out loud. After a long moment, he reached out and touched one of them, not to take, not yet, but to acknowledge that it was real, that what had happened was not something that would vanish when the dust settled. Then he slipped the turquoise piece back into his pocket, the motion simple, unremarkable, as if it belonged there now, as if it had always been meant to return with him. When he finally turned, his gaze passed over the town without stopping on any one face, not searching, not accusing, just seeing. There was no pride in his expression, no sense of victory, only the same steady calm he had carried before any of this began. Someone near the back shifted, as if about to speak, then thought better of it. The silence held. Elias walked back toward his porch, each step unhurried, the boards creaking under his weight as he reached the door. He paused there for a second, looking out over the land that had not changed, the fence that now carried a different meaning, the road that led back to a town that would not look at him the same way again, whether they understood why or not. He did not need them to. Out here, understanding was not something you asked for. It was something that showed itself when it mattered, and stayed quiet the rest of the time. He opened the door and stepped inside, the light of morning following him just far enough to touch the edge of the table before the room settled back into its usual stillness. Outside, the last trace of the riders disappeared beyond the rise, leaving nothing behind but the faint imprint of hooves and the kind of silence that lingers after something has been set right without a single shot fired. And in that silence, the truth of it remained, simple and unshaken. Out here, a man did not need to be loud to be heard. He only needed to stand when others would not, and let the rest speak for itself.